Thank you very much for coming. I think that our democracy is in trouble, which is a massive claim to make. And one that doesn't sit easy, because I think probably everyone here was born in a democracy, and we've all lived in a democracy, and I think it's very easy to think to yourself that it's the natural state of being, or at least once you've achieved it, what could go wrong? And I think a lot is going wrong, and that's what I want to talk about. And I think part of the reason I want to talk about the Green Party, apart from the fact that I am a member, is because I think it's very clear that all of the other parties, they're concerned not really with democracy. What they're concerned with is getting power within the current system. And if the price of them getting power is giving away a little bit of the democracy which underpins that system, well, so yeah, that's fine. That's the price of admission. If I get to play at the top table and I've got to give away a little bit of democracy, fine. I think the opportunity is there for a party, and I believe it is the Green Party, to say, no, we don't want to just have power within any system. We want to get power to protect democracy, not give it away so we can get power. So I think there's an opportunity, and it's a necessary one. It's necessary for any party to do this, because none of the other parties are. I think the reason that our democracy is under attack, I want to talk to you about the attack, the danger to our democracy of the trade agreements. I think probably most people have heard of the trade agreements now. I mean, there's a whole range of them. The first of them being NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. You probably will remember that. And then there's the TTIP and the TPP, and there's one that you probably haven't heard of, but may end up being more dangerous than all of the rest. It's called TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. This is being negotiated very, very quietly right now. And we will, I think, know what's the danger with the trade agreements, in that they talk about wanting to harmonize standards between America and Europe. And what they made very clear in the Americans in their documents is what they mean by that is they want access for their agricultural goods and products in Europe. And in order to do that, they need to harmonize our regulations about food and agricultural products. And what they mean by harmonize is lower standards. Of course, they will say that's absolutely not true. But there is a major difference between the American approach and our approach. In Europe, we tend to have what's called the precautionary principle. What that means is that it is up to a company to prove that there is no harm, there's no danger from their product. In America, they have the opposite. The government has to prove that there is harm. So that's a complete reversal. So for instance, in the States, you have much lower animal welfare standards for, say, something like chickens. You can have them in or any kind of conditions you want. And then right at the end, just before you sell it for someone to buy it, you bathe it in chlorine. We won't allow that here. But they want to harmonise the standards, which means we'll accept their standard. The Americans will allow growth hormone to be. We're not so sure about growth hormones. And they say, what's the problem? Look how healthy Americans are. Obviously, it's obviously great stuff. And they want to do things like they would like GM to be allowed into Europe, and they want no labelling for GM, so that you can't say, well, it's got GM in it, I won't like that. They're not really keen on country of origin labelling. So there's a great many things that they would like to change. Now, in fairness, what we want to do is have access to their financial system to sell them even more dodgy financial products than they come up with. We love derivatives, they're even more dangerous than the rubbish they sell in America, and we want to have that sold there. So that's fair enough. They're going to give us shit food, we'll give them shit financial products. Excellent, everyone's a winner. But the thing about trade agreements is trade agreements are diplomatic agreements. They happen in public. You get world leaders stand in the spotlight and try and negotiate with them. And because they are very public things, and they are diplomatic agreements, agreements between two nations, if you get a change of government, then the new government can go, well, you know, I think we'd like to tinker with that trade agreement. Or, I know it says that in the trade agreement, but I think we'll just ignore that clause a bit. Now, you only have to look at what's happened with, say, the World Trade Organization, which is the big granddaddy of all trade agreements. It's been an unworkable mess because countries just ignore the rulings. There's umpteen ways of just of avoiding a ruling or putting it off, and it takes years to do anything. And since the passing of the Uruguay round in '96, when the General Agreement Trade and Tariffs, GATT, became the World Trade Organization, in the intervening time, big business has become more and more frustrated with that World Trade Organization trade agreement approach. Because it happens between nations, it's too easy for a nation to avoid it. So if you've got a list of things that you want, such as the Americans had for their agricultural products, how do you force it on a nation of people? How do you make it such that it can't be tinkered with, that it can't be changed by an incoming government? Right? And the answer is the thing which has gotten almost no press and is nested inside the trade agreements. So inside the TTIP is a thing called a bilateral investment treaty, known in the trade as a BIT. And it is that which gives the trade agreement teeth and claws. And nested inside the BIT is the thing called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement. I know there are lots of acronyms. The reason it's important to know them is because when you get into a discussion with anybody who is in favour of all of this, they will choose which of those acronyms they use so that you feel like you don't know what they're talking about. It's Russian dollars. Inside the trade agreement is a bilateral investment treaty, and inside that is the ISDS. I'll explain what they are. It was NAFTA which welded these two things together. The trade agreement, which is this big agreement between nations, and the bilateral investment treaty. Bilateral investment treaty is not a diplomatic agreement between nations. It's a completely different thing from a trade agreement. It's a piece of international law. Therefore, it's not the province of the Tony Blairs and the George Bushes, or any of the other trade monkeys that we elect. It's between lawyers, which means once that bit is signed, then they'll say, well, this has got nothing to do with what government you vote for. This is a piece of international law, which means you're stuck with it. And what they did in NAFTA, and this was the genius idea, is they said, here's this big trade agreement. How do we force Canada, America, and Mexico to adhere to this? And they put a bilateral investment treaty inside it. Now, I don't know if any of you read about NAFTA during all those years. Every time NAFTA is mentioned, they talk about Chapter 11. That Chapter 11 is what allowed America, the nation, to be sued by companies. Chapter 11 is a bilateral investment treaty. What they do is they give a corporation the ability to sue an entire nation. That's what a bilateral investment treaty does. It is a piece of international law. Once it's in place, there's nothing that anyone can do about it. It's not a matter of voting anymore. The bilateral investment treaties were a rather obscure bit of international law. The first one was 1959, signed between Germany and Pakistan, I think. And for years and years and years, it was just obscure. What they were invented for is they said, imagine that we build a factory in Zaire, and then there's a revolution in Zaire, and the new revolutionary government just nationalizes our factory. That's not fair. So they invented this piece of international law to say there should be some way in which the company that's just had all its goods expropriated can have some redress. And what they said is, in these countries where there's a war, they'll talk about a weak government or a weak rule of law. We need some other venue where our company can get redress. And so we're going to set up this way for a company to sue a nation. So I think it's an extraordinary notion. And for years it was very obscure. Nobody knew about them because between 1959 and 1986 nothing happened. They were never used. The first case brought was not until 1986. And even in the next 10 years there were only 38 cases brought. So it was obscure and nobody really cared about it. Then NAFTA comes along and says, let's put this thing inside a trade agreement. Right? And now, if, for instance, to give you an example, the state of Quebec decided it didn't like fracking. So it was a big outcry, people mobilized, and so the government listened to people and said, all right, well, we'll hold up the permits on fracking. The company that had been granted the right previously took them to arbitration, and the government of Quebec lost and had to reinstate fracking. That is the power of the bilateral investment treaty. And they have grown massively in the last 10 or 15 years. Right? There are now between 2,000 and 3,000 of these agreements between nations. So what happens is I make an agreement with another nation. I think this country has over 80 agreements already signed. It means then that a company from that foreign country with whom we've made this agreement now can sue us if we do something they don't like. Now, the important thing is that when I talk about suing, it doesn't happen in a court of law. Right? This bit of international law is almost entirely separate from almost all the rest of international law. Okay, so, what are they? How do they work? Who runs them? The Bilateral Investment Treaty says a company can sue a nation. The way they do it is they take you to arbitration. They don't go to a court. There is no judge. There is no jury. Right? That's not how they work. The way it works is there are 3 arbitrators who are chosen. One by the company that's suing the nation, one by the nation that is being sued, and then those 2 arbitrators choose the third. If they can't agree, the third can be imposed upon them. I'll explain who will do the imposing later. Those 3 people are not trained judges. They are not people who work for a public organization. Those arbitrators are private individuals who will be from one of a very small number of international law firms. Right? So there's no accountability. There's no leverage or accountability that you or any other citizen of any nation has for these people at all. I know it seems like I'm just making this up, and I wish I was. But I can show you the documents from the arbitrators, not from the NGOs, from their own writings, and it's there, it's in black and white. So we've got 3 arbitrators, and they meet behind closed doors. There is no ability for an interested party to sit in, and certainly not to make a representation. They don't have to, and they generally don't, let you know who was called to give evidence, nor what evidence was given, nor what their reasoning for their decision was. And there is no appeal. They don't even have to tell you that your nation has gone to arbitration. This nation could be in arbitration right now, and we would not know. They don't have to tell us. Because these things are carried out not by a public body or under the supervision of a public body or with any kind of oversight at all. This is entirely private. So, if you don't believe me, let me give you a quote from a man called Fernandez Ernesto, who is an arbitrator. He is one of this group. And this is what he said. This is a quote from something he wrote recently. When I wake at night and think about arbitration, it never ceases to amaze me that sovereign states have agreed to arbitration at all. 3 private individuals are entrusted with the power to review without any restriction or appeal procedure all actions of the government, all decisions of the courts, and all laws and regulations emanating from Parliament. Now I ask you, did he leave anything out? 3 people, private individuals, can do that, and they can do it for this country. So, what's the basis of arbitration? Well, arbitration in bilateral investment treaties, which, let me remind you, is a little bit nested inside the trade agreements. It's inside NAFTA, it's inside the TTIP, it's inside all of them. It's the essential bit. Remember, without it, it's just a big diplomatic blancmange which can be avoided willy-nilly. This is the thing which makes it hurt. It's based on 4 things. 4 principles lie at the root of arbitration. No nationalization or expropriation. That's the first thing you sign up to when you sign a bilateral investment treaty. Second, there must be equal treatment. Sounds reasonable. 3, treatment of a foreign company must be fair and equitable. What could be fairer than that? And lastly, any dispute between the company and the nation must immediately accept arbitration. Fine. Okay. No nationalization. That is the, we built a factory in Zaire, there was a revolution, they took our factory, they burnt it down, surely we're owed some money. When you put it like that, you think, that's entirely sensible. Fine. That's the way that's the example, that is a real example actually, that they always trot out. However, there's that word expropriation. Now, a word like expropriation is just like a balloon that you can blow up. Hand a word like that to international lawyers, and it can mean anything you want. Because, and it does mean anything they want. Because expropriation now does not mean that they just came in and took the keys to your factory and said, nah, 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 it's ours now. That's not what they mean. Expropriation can mean the loss of future earnings. So remember the example I gave you of the fracking company in Quebec. They sued Quebec because they said, because you've now prevented us from carrying out the fracking we were going to, and in our figures, we figured if we were allowed to frack, we would have made this much money over the next 10 years. You've expropriated that money. We haven't earned yet, but thought we would. So you better give it to us now, and they did. And expropriation can mean, and this is also something that's been written about in the journals of the arbitrators, and there are several, that the level of tax set by a country, if it falls outside of the reasonable expectations of the company at the time they signed the contract, that too would be expropriation. What that means is, if a company set up in this country and said, we're expecting that the tax rate will stay at whatever it is, 15%, and then a government that you elect comes in on a platform and they said, well, we're going to increase it to 25%. I'm just making the numbers up, by the way. They would say that's expropriation. And do you know what? They'd win. Because 3 private individuals working for large companies would decide they won. Because in arbitration, they don't decide the right and the wrongness, or the did 80% of the country vote for it or not. It doesn't come into it. That's just irrelevant. That's not part of their decision at all. So let's move. So let me give you another example. After Fukushima, the Germans decided, after a massive public outcry, I think we'll wind up, let's close our nuclear program. I think whether you agree with it or not, surely that is a legitimate decision for a sovereign people to take. I would have thought that's what democracy is about. However, the Swedish company Vattenfall, who happened to operate some of those, said, wait, you just expropriated our future profits. And they took them to arbitration for 700 million euros. The people said, we'd like to close them. The arbitrator said, you can, but you've just expropriated stuff. In this country, fracking. I gave you the example of Quebec. If a foreign company, because remember this only applies to foreign companies, if a foreign company buys into fracking and gets a permit, and then, say the next government comes in and says, moratorium on fracking, we would be taken to arbitration and we would lose. I know we would lose because it's already been fought and lost in Quebec. The precedent is already there. And if there's one thing international lawyers love, it's a precedent. It's like a Christmas present. PFI, that's another thing. We all know a disastrous PFI. If anyone came in and said, we're just going to clear this mess up, no, you won't. That's the point of this stuff, is that it means that a lot of things which you would think, this is my democratic right, I'm allowed to choose this, we're a sovereign people, that sovereignty's already been given away. Equal treatment seems fair. What that means is, unless they change the wording of the agreement as it currently stands, and obviously there's a normal special to change it, but I don't think they've changed the wording yet. The NHS would fall foul of that immediately, because a foreign health company would say, how can we make inroads into your health system when your NHS is getting completely unfair treatment? This is not fair and equitable. The BBC would be another one. You're giving a subsidy to them. It has to stop. That's what fair and equitable means. Sorry, that's equal treatment. Let's move on to fair and equitable. You'd think they're the same thing, but they're not. And fair and equitable, if it's possible to even be more broad than expropriation, fair and equitable managed, it's utterly meaningless, because who decides what's fair and what's equitable? And the answer is the arbitrators. Because remember, there's nobody else who gets a look in. Let me give an example. There was a company called Pacific Rim, and they wanted to mine gold in El Salvador. In the usual way, not with pickaxes, basically you just hose down a mountainside with water containing arsenic, dissolves the gold out, you get the gold, and the arsenic runoff ends up in the rivers. This mine was going to be right near one of the major watercourses in El Salvador. There was a massive protest. And this is organisation of people living in very rural areas in El Salvador. 3 of the organisers died. This was, serious stuff. This wasn't just signing a few petitions. This was bare knuckle stuff. But they did organise sufficiently over several years that they got the El Salvadorian government to say, yeah, this will pollute the watercourse, you're right, we'll stop the permit. Pacific Rim, they took the El Salvadoran government, the nation, to arbitration for $315 million. I don't think El Salvador has a spare $315 million. I think they did actually, yeah. Pacific Rim. The other thing about arbitration is if you look at the figures, the nation hardly ever wins. There was another example, Canada. They wanted to ban, this is an old one actually, they wanted to ban a fuel additive called MMT, which they felt was rather nasty stuff. So they said, fine, we banned it. US Ethyl, which was the producer of this stuff, an American company, took them to arbitration, and Canada lost on the grounds that they didn't have enough of the right kind of evidence to prove that MMT was as dangerous as they said. Remember what I said about the precautionary principle versus the American version? So this was the American version saying, you haven't proved it's dangerous. Whereas we would say, yeah, you haven't proved that it's safe. Canada lost. They had to pay up, apologise, and allow MMT to be sold. So much for the sovereign will of the people. So then that brings you to number 4, you have to go to arbitration. So let me give you another quote. This is by a woman called Susan Frank, who's a law professor who is an expert in arbitration. This is in a long paper that she wrote about arbitration. And she says, as an immediate matter, taxpayers may be faced with paying an award that may be legally incorrect. Okay? And that has happened. And these taxpayers have no rights within the treaty or any means of redress. And that is the fact. Remember, because there's no oversight, they can say something which your senior law will hear and go, that's crackers. It doesn't matter. You could have Jesus Christ could come down and say, excuse me, that's a rubbish decision. And the arbitrators would go, are you an arbitrator? No, you're bugger off. There's no oversight in a nation of this. It's entirely separate. Okay, who? Who are these people? And I think this is important. This isn't just character assassination, this is important. Because there are 20 firms which basically do all of the arbitration. 20. These are the 20 biggest of the global law firms. They're almost all American and a few European. Which means that, and these are big, I mean the top 3 are Freshfields in the UK, White & Case in the US, and King & Spalding in the US. Now, none of those companies are known for their for fighting civil rights cases, or labour union cases, or environmental cases. These companies work for and advise the big corporations and the big banks. Freshfields, I think, were advisors to the Irish government, and some of they've all been, Freshfields particularly, have all been involved in those big mergers between banks and when banks collapsed. And that's what they do. They earn 1,500 quid an hour. The average arbitration, the average cost of going to arbitration, win or lose, is about $8 million. This is not the poor man's law, this is rich man's law. Right? So we've got 3 arbitrators, and they're all chosen from 20 firms, top global firms, and they're all pretty much share the same mindset. These are people who live in that world of global cooperation, global free trade, and the law which underpins it. They're not known for their environmental concerns. In fact, several of them have written specifically to say labour laws, social justice, and environmental concerns should not be part of arbitration. I can point you to the article what that is. Within those 20 firms, 15 arbitrators, just 15 people, have decided 55% of all the known cases. And of the cases where the claim was big, $4 billion worth or above, those top 15 arbitrators have decided 75% of the cases worldwide. Now just hang on a second. That's 75% of all the cases involving all the nations, all the taxpayers of the world. 75% of them have been decided by 15 people whose names you do not know, you will never meet because they don't shop at Sainsbury's or Co. You don't know where they met, you don't know what evidence they've used, you don't know who spoke up in defense, and you don't know how they came to their decision. And if you don't like it, tough, you have no means of redress or appeal. That is the law that successive US and UK governments have signed you up to already. 80 bilateral agreements already. Let me give you an example of who these people are. One of a very powerful one is a man called Jan Paulsen. He's a triple national. His nationalities are Swedish, French, and Bahraini. So you tell me where he feels some loyalty. Oh, and he's based in the UK. There's another man, oh, and by the way, he wrote a blistering article, absolutely apoplectic with rage, about countries trying to regain control of their national resources and then sharing those national resources out. It was an outrage! Another man called Karl-Heinz Bockstiegel, when he writes about this, about nations versus companies, he always, without fail, uses this analogy where the companies are David and the nations are Goliath. So the company that sued El Salvador was David, and El Salvador was Goliath. It's funny, but what I'm trying to show you is that 20 firms, 15 people, and they share a very, very narrow mindset. Others, if you look at what they do, these top 15 people, they appear on the boards of, one of them has been on the board of Citibank, Another has been on the board of UBS, and one of them served for 16 years in various positions under Pinochet. So the claims that are made for arbitration and for arbitrators, as they say, remember going back to this notion that where you get these countries where there's a weak rule of law and weak government and you'd never be able to get proper redress. So they say the value of arbitration is that whereas inside a country, the law system of that country or the government of that system is biased and it's untrustworthy, whereas arbitrators, well, we're clear-sighted people without any prejudices at all, and international law is there to serve everyone's interest. Yeah. They represent a very narrow worldview, and that worldview is imposed, not just imposed upon you, but is given legal status above you and above your government, which means, I would say, then why did the government sign up to that? Why would they do that? Well, maybe there's still hope. I mean, what organisations sort of oversee these nutty arbitrators? Well, there are a handful. In fact, there are 5. There's the ICSIS, the International Centre for Settlement of Investor Disputes. It's a part of the World Bank. And before you go, oh, luckily, the global organisation, the World Bank is not on your side. Right? The World Bank, okay? The only people that make the World Bank look good are the IMF, who are the modern. I'm going to be rude, but I won't be. Then there's the London Court of International Arbitration. It's a not-for-profit limited company. It's not a public body at all. It's a limited company. In fact, it's not-for-profit, who cares? Which means it has a board, it has CEOs, what it does is confidential. It's the most secret of them all. It doesn't fringe anything. There's the ICC, which is based in Paris. It's the International Chamber of Commerce. The International Chamber of Commerce is a business lobby group, and they will oversee arbitration too. So a company could take us to the ICC, and the business lobby group will oversee the fair and equitable treatment we get at the hands of 15 people, or 3 people chosen from 50 people. Then there's the Hong Kong International Arbitration Centre. Again, it's a private, not-for-profit, limited company. And then there's UNCTAD, the UN Commission of International Trade Law. So you go, all right, fine with the UN. Its mandate is to promote global trade. So it already has a very definite bias. Those are the only people who oversee these. So we have 20 companies